I want to talk about newspapers. Newspapers are kind of in a period of what we might call disruptive transition. They're in this period of, like that with the internet and with advertising sales being down, everything. Newspapers have really begun to change a lot. The number of newspapers sold, circulations are down because people are happy reading it online. They don't want to pay for news content when they can just go online and get the content for free. They are, the circulation during the recession, people didn't want to pay, but then advertisers didn't want to pay, which they get a lot of money. Newspapers make most of their money off advertising. And so there were a lot of things that affected the newspaper industry. And right now we're kind of in a period of, there's definitely a shakeup. But at one point, the newspaper, as it was in the history of newspapers, it was really one of the first public things that would give you a daily digest of what was going on, other than just word of mouth gossip. It was something that was verified. Somebody looked it up. You could read it in print. You didn't have to just rely upon what so-and-so heard and what so-and-so heard and what so-and-so heard. Somebody would go out there, gather the information, and give it to you in a concise manner. And so what happens is that the newspaper eventually began to... the newspaper at one time was kind of that main piece. At one time, like Springfield had 2 or 3 newspapers, daily newspapers. They had a morning paper and afternoon paper. There was the Journal and there was the Register. Those were 2 separate papers. And I believe there was another one at the time as well, like 30 or 40 years ago. And then they consolidated. They became one company. And then now, there's just one paper every day. And that may not even be there in 10 years. But the case is used to, there were lots of them. That's why a lot of newspapers, a lot of towns have double names, like the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. It's 2 papers. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I think there was the Post and there was the Dispatch, and those combined. And there also used to be a couple other newspapers in St. Louis. At one time, Chicago had 11 newspapers. I think it was 11, may have been 13, but I know it was at least 11. They had morning papers, they had afternoon papers for people who were getting off at a factory. They'd have the latest news. They had newspapers that were aimed more towards union, more towards business, and they all had different markets. They all had different things, sort of like TV news. There's Fox and CNN and everything. This was how people got their news, and there were always newspapers we had. And it was an inexpensive way, for a nickel, for a dime, for a quarter, for 50 cents. Today it would probably be like 50 cents. Now newspapers cost like $1, but they might be a little pricey for comparatively through history. I've not actually looked at that. But even for like $1, if that's your only source of news, $1 a day, to pick it up at the newsstand, or you get a subscription for $15 a month or $20 a month, that's actually not a bad deal. It's just we now have TV, internet. We don't really feel like we need to pay $20 to know what's going on. And so that's been a very big change or transition in that industry. With that said, I want to give you a short history of the newspaper. Kind of a fun thing is like, what was the first newspaper ever made? And the answer that, is they kind of trace it back to Rome, to Rome with Caesar, the BC era. And basically, at the end of each day, at the Senate meeting, somebody would journal and they would chronicle everything that went down. They would write down everything that happened, and they would put it out on a piece of paper that they would hang up on the wall of the Senate, where the Senate met, and it was called the Acta Diurna, which is like the daily actions or the daily work. And it would just kind of chronicle, and they only made 1 copy, and it was hung up, and people would go and read it. And that would be probably the earliest form of a newspaper. They printed 1 copy. I wouldn't even say they printed, they wrote out 1 copy, they hung it on the wall, and everybody read that 1 copy. Okay, that would be the earliest newspaper, the idea of a daily briefing of everything that is news. As far as that, there have been a few instances, but probably the first real daily paper there was one called Corantus. It was an English language newspaper. It was in 1620 that it was published in Holland, and it was imported every day back to England, and it was basically information about what was going on in the 30-Year War. There was a war going on. I don't know if it lasted 30 years. There's a few of them they're called like the 30-Year War, but were actually like 40 or something. I forget exactly, but it was a long-standing feud. There were battles regularly, and they would give kind of that information, and that was kind of a daily report that would get sent back and sent out to people or sold to people back in England, and so that they would know what was going on in Holland. there were a few people who made attempts to start publishing, didn't go very much. Um, they were kind of what were called, the early ones were called diurnals. That's from that diurna, acta diurna. Diurnals were basically daily, is what it means. It means daily and dailies, and they just gave kind of the news. And newspaper as a term wasn't actually used until 1660 in England. Somebody began to call it a newspaper. The first newspaper to be printed in the United States was by a guy named Benjamin Harris. He owned a coffee house and a printing shop, and he was a bookseller. And in 1690, he made a book. He put out a broadsheet, just a one-sided sheet of paper. It would have been probably old broadsheet newspapers. Broadsheet's kind of like that traditional, wide newspaper. That today they're only about this wide, but back in the day they would have been twice that wide. They were actually quite. It's interesting to see one today, like an old broadside, because they just look humongous. But people would read those, and they'd have to actually hold their arms out almost all the way to keep the thing open. Well, he came up with a one sheet, one page, all on the front, just words, nothing more, just a whole page of words. And it was called Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic. And it gave all the news. He published it one time, and that was it. But that would have been the first newspaper. After that, there were various attempts. People would publish a couple copies, maybe a couple others. They'd go for a few weeks, few months, few years, and they would die out. But by 1721, within 31 years, there were 3 newspapers in Boston. There was James Franklin which was Benjamin Franklin's brother, had the New England Courant, which is still around. It was very critical of the governor, the governor at the time, and he ended up at some point being jailed for libel, and he ended up his brother Benjamin became the publisher. And he ended up, when he left 3 years later, it ended up going away. But Benjamin Franklin then went to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, where he started the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he kind of took up his brother's critical nature of the government, and he became a publisher there. There was also at this time a guy named Peter Zanger, or John Peter Zanger, and he was jailed for sedition, and this was sort of set up as a very big trial at the time, as he was going to be, for sedition, for having undermined it, and there were a lot of arguments. The trial ended up not really setting any precedents, but it did definitely set up that the press was going to do its own thing, and that they were going to challenge the government, and that there was going to be the need for free press. After the War of Independence, newspapers were largely kind of anti-government, foreign government, anti-British government. And so now we had our own government, but realizing that, they came up with the First Amendment, which gave protection. But there were attempts even during the early days, because people didn't like the fact that newspapers would be critical of the government. They knew that those newspapers were very essential in the undermining of the British government, of allowing for democracy to flourish. And so they passed the Alien and Sedition Act, which made it illegal to say bad things about the newspaper. But it passed. Never really much protection on it. Never really did much. But in 1800, Congress didn't decide to renew it. So that's kind of an early stage. At the same time, I got to talk a little bit about what newspapers were at the time and how that relates to other things. Basically, at the time, newspapers were largely kind of business publications. People who bought newspapers, they were a nickel or a dime. And while not expensive in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they were expensive, and they weren't something most people had much interest in. Literacy was finally beginning to take off, and books were beginning to sell, but the mass population wasn't highly literate. It was still, it was highly literate compared to England, but it was not, like 100%. Half the people wouldn't have been able to have read the newspaper anyway, and the stuff in it would have been mainly business stuff. It would have been like, there would have been an issue with like, what's the what's coming in to the harbor that like what are the new ships? What's the merchant ships? What are they carrying? Are they carrying flour? Are they covering gold? Are they carrying slaves? Whatever it be. And so what happens is that's what a lot of newspapers did. They kind of just did this daily accounting, and it was stuff that people in business, people in government would be highly interested in because it would be very business oriented, right? And so the average person didn't have a lot of interest in it. But then around the same time, there began to become, in like it really was more not until like the until like Benjamin Day. He came up with an idea in 1833. He was going to sell a 1-cent newspaper, and he was going to publish a little bit more filled with more interest, human interest, more crime news, more things like that. And then Horace Greeley, he started the New York Tribune. But he was focused on, he was focused on social action. And so there became different newspapers at the time. There were African-American newspapers, which continue to be a big part of that industry. There's still an African-American newspaper here in Springfield, as well as Chicago and other places. And so the newspaper became kind of, fractured in the sense that there were different groups with different agendas. But the newspaper, while there were some attempts to make it wildly popular by the masses, they were not focused on the masses, okay? And they were very much really kind of dry, very factual, and they would not be the newspaper you see today. They would not have pictures. They would have just been long columns of text broken up with a larger headline, and it would have been very hard to follow. As a matter of fact, if you see an old newspaper from 1850, most of us, even the Wall Street Journal, had that format up until the 1990s. And if you picked one up, it was just the entire front page was just text. It was just columns of text, and you would kind of scan down each column to find the news you wanted. And that's the way people did it. But I mean, that was, it was small. It had news, and people weren't used to kind of a visual medium of TV and film, and so that need for pictures and everything just wasn't there, as well as there wasn't a mode to put that. I mean, you were putting in physical pieces of metal. You couldn't do that easily. You'd have to actually carve the metal or create a plate for the metal to put a picture in. And they did. It just wasn't as easy to do that. And so that was not a focus by any means. And as a matter of fact, the pictures weren't even possible. It would have had to have been a drawing because the photography wasn't really around in the early 1800s. So just kind of because it's the first wire service. The first wire service is kind of, I think, speaks to what the newspaper in the early days was, besides having the effect of sedition and other things along with the book, anything that was printed. The other thing is the newspaper tended to be run by a local postmaster, general store owner, just like the book industry, because they were the ones who had it, and they had the time, and they got the news, and they had the ability to do it. But what happened was, in 1848, there were 6 newspapers in New York, and all of them tended to focus on business news. And when a ship would come into the harbor, they would all send a reporter out to get the information on what's on the ship, how many crew, where did it come from, things like that, right? What are they looking to buy? What are they looking to ship out? Things like that. And so they would all send it out, and they all wanted to have that information the next day, so they didn't want to be the one who didn't have it. Well, what would end up happening is the boat would pull in, and it would anchor, and there weren't, then they would have to, wait, and, they would have to, the people would get off in a rowboat and row in to, get on shore, and then they'd eventually unload it. They'd pull up into one of the dock spaces. But, the boat moored out in the thing. So the reporter wanting to get the story first before it was going to pull into dock, they would row their boat out and they would get the story. Well, the problem was there were 6 newspapers and all of them wanted it. So they'd all row their boat out there. And what eventually they said is, why do we each have our own reporter doing basically information that we all want and can share? And so what they did was they said, why don't we, with the ships, we'll all go out there. One person will take a day. They'll go out. They'll go to all the ships. They'll bring it back, and then we'll run the copy around all the papers. Nobody has an advantage. Nobody takes advantage of anybody else, and we can all get the same news. And that became the first, what they call, wire service. And that became the Associated Press, and then eventually that led to things like United Press, International, Associated Press, various news services, was the idea of a collective gathering of news, because it was all based upon, we're all doing the same thing. Why are we all doing it? Why don't we just have one person do it?